The drive shaft, which is inside the swing arm, connects to the rear output flange of the transmission, and there's a rubber bellows secured by a couple of hose clamps that fits over that assembly. So I'll remove the bellows, and then there are 4 bolts that attach the drive shaft to the output flange of the transmission, and I'll be able to remove those. Now the rubber boot or bellows is held on by some straps, and this is one of them that I got off. So it's a screwdriver that you got to get on there, and this one's pretty bunged up, but I'm getting it to come loose. So once I get that off, normally what you do is just slide the boot back to get to the nuts that secure the drive shaft to the transmission output flange. But I'm just going to cut this off with a knife because it's completely rotted. I removed that rubber bellows, and these are the 4 12-sided bolts that secure the drive shaft to the transmission output shaft. And I found that it's easier to get at them if you take a 10 mil box and grind it down, because there's not a lot of clearance on these. And then when you get them on, what you want to do is put the transmission in first gear, so there's a lot of engine resistance. And then if you take a hammer, you can get them to break loose just like that. So what you'll have to do is rotate this drive shaft to get to all 4 bolts. So you'll have to take the transmission into neutral, rotate it, put it in first, and then loosen up the next bolt. Once I break all the nuts loose, then I can back them out by hand, but I don't want to drop them down into the drive shaft. So I'm kind of careful here to get them to come loose. Now I normally replace these when I reinstall the drive shaft, just because they take so much stress. It's probably worth it for how little they cost to just put new ones in. Now that I've got the 4 bolts out, the drive shaft flange is loose and off of the output flange on the transmission. There's a plastic cap that fits over this hole in the frame, and this is the pivot bolt and locking nut that secure the swing arm to the frame. Now to remove that locking nut, it's a tight fit, so what you need is a 26 millimeter socket that's been cut down so that it can slide in and fit over the bolt. And then you just back that lock nut out, and then you can take an Allen, insert it into the pivot bolt, and back that out. Now I've got that cut down 26 millimeter socket, and I'll put it on the nut, and they're usually pretty tight. So I find that if I brace myself against the peg and I lean into it, I can get it to crack loose. So then you just back that locking nut out of there. Now to take out the pivot bolt, it's an Allen that fits into the center, and they can be a little bit hard, but this one's turning. There we go. And you just back that all the way out. Yeah, still got a little ways to go. And part of it is I got off my jack stand. Okay, so that's the pivot bolt, the threads and the pivot, and this is what fits inside the swing arm bearing. Now that I've got both pivot bolts loose, I can just pick the swing arm up and get it out. Now this is the flange on the drive shaft that attaches to the output flange on the transmission. And I'm going to remove the drive shaft because I'm going to powder coat the swing arm. After I mount the transmission to the engine block, I need to connect it to the output shaft, and these are the parts used for that. Now there's a boot that goes between the back of the transmission and the swing arm, and on one side of the boot are some markings. There's a long German word here spelled G-E-T-R-I-E-B-E-S-E-I-T-E, which means transmission. And then on the other end is O-B-E-N, which is German for top. So this is the top, and this is the face that goes against the transmission, and then this is the face that goes on the swing arm. Now this is held on by two very large hose clamps, one on each end here. And then to connect the output flange from the transmission to the drive shaft are these 4 bolts. And they've actually been pre-treated with Loctite. So that's how the transmission connects to the drive shaft. So I'm getting ready to connect the drive shaft to the transmission output flange. And I installed the pivot bolts for the swing arm, so it's in about the right location. And I've installed the rubber boot with Oben up here, and that lettering points to the transmission. So I have the boot in the right orientation. Now the connection is made with these 4 12-sided bolts, and in my case they came pre-coated with a little Loctite. If yours don't have any, try using a little blue Loctite on them. It's a good insurance policy to keep them from coming loose. Now there's 4 of them, and the yoke has 4 arms, as does the output flange. So you have to line up the hole on the yoke with the hole on the output flange, and then you have to get one of the bolts to get going, and you have to pull the boot out of the way while you do it. So this is a real gymnastics act. I generally can get it to start with 2 fingers and kind of hold it in place, but once I get the first one on, it goes a lot easier. Now it's possible for you, while you're doing that, to have a bolt drop and go down the swing arm tube the drive shaft is in. And that's no fun, but I use a really long magnet, and I can go down the inside of the swing arm, and I can fish that bolt back out again. So it's not the end of the world, but it can be frustrating when they drop on you. Now to tighten up the bolts, I have a screwdriver wrapped in rags that is underneath the swing arm legs and through the cast wheel, so that keeps everything from turning. And then I use a 12-sided wrench, a box, to fit on the nut, and I lean into this until it kind of really hurts and puts a pretty good dent in my hand. And that's probably as tight as they need to be. And then the last thing I like to do is take a paint pen and mark that I have torqued that. So as I go around, I won't miss a bolt, and that's a good insurance policy. Now I pulled the boot onto the transmission, and I checked to make sure it's even and tight up against the casting here. And I take apart the hose clamp because it's a lot easier to get the boot and the bolts on without these in your way. So now all I do is just slide it under like that, and basically rotate it around and hook everything together like that. Oh, I have the 2 straps attached, And there's a tab on the back here of the swing arm at the top, and there's a companion on the bottom, and that kind of catches the end of the bellows to help keep it from sliding off the swing.